Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan and welcome back to my video channel. Thank you so much for joining me for yet another video in our series on LXD for Linux that allows you to deploy and manage virtual machines as well as containers. Now, in this video, we're going to be exploring a feature inside of LXD known as profiles. And no, I'm not talking about your LinkedIn profile. I'm talking about configuration profiles for your virtual machines inside of LXD. Now, before we jump into the concepts behind profiles, make sure that you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and please also share a link to this video or playlist with your friends, your family, and your professional contacts to help me grow this channel as an independent content creator. All right, so let's talk conceptually about what profiles are in LXD virtual machine configuration. So we're going to start out with a pretty basic setup right here. We've already talked about how to install LXD. We've also talked about things like storage pools as well. I've got a separate video that actually introduces the concept of storage pools. And so let's say that you've got a LXD host and you have at the bare minimum your default storage pool, and maybe you've created some additional custom storage pools as well. Now, we're going to introduce profiles here. So we haven't really discussed profiles yet, and that's because when you install LXD and you start creating virtual machines, there's actually this hidden default profile that's used whenever you launch a new virtual machine. We haven't had to specify it because every time that we use the launch command from the LXC command line utility to create a new virtual machine, this default profile is automatically associated with the new virtual machine that we create, regardless of which operating system we are deploying. So it could be Ubuntu Linux, it could be Alpine Linux, it could be OpenSUSE, pretty much anything. And this default profile gets associated with that virtual machine and does some basic configuration. A couple of particulars that get configured on that new virtual machine by the default profile are a couple of devices that get added to each virtual machine. Specifically, we've got a network interface card, or NIC, and we also have the disk, or the virtual disk configuration, that assigns a root file system to each of the new virtual machines that we deploy. In fact, in an earlier video, we actually talked about how the default size of the root file system for LXD virtual machines is 10 gigabytes. You're welcome to expand or decrease the size of the root file system if you'd like to, but that is the default configuration out of the box with LXD if you don't customize it any further. Now, let's say that we have some specific customizations that we want to apply to the virtual machines that we are managing within a LXD host. An example of something that we might want to customize is the size of our root file system. So maybe we want to override the default configuration of the root disk, the root virtual disk, I should say, from 10 gigabytes. And maybe we want to expand that out to a larger size because we're going to be installing some large software. Maybe we're going to spin up a database server that needs some extra storage. Whatever reasoning it may be, maybe we want to assign 20 gigabytes to the root file system instead of just 10 gigabytes. Another option that we might want to set as far as the file system goes is changing the storage pool where the root virtual disk gets created. So rather than relying on the default storage pool, and rather than having to specify the storage parameter every time that we create a virtual machine, we can simply point to a profile that specifies which pool is going to have the root file system for this newly created virtual machine. So we could create a profile using the LXC profile create command here to create a new profile with a name like larger disk, for example. You can call it whatever you want to. And then we can use the LXC profile set command to customize a profile by its name and then set the setting key to a certain value. Now, this works with a lot of virtual machine settings, but when it comes to customizing things like the device configurations, like our root file system or network interface configuration or GPUs that we want to attach to a LXD virtual machine, we can actually also interactively edit the profile with a text editor like Nano or Vim by simply using a different command called LXD Profile Edit and specify the name, and then we can actually type out the different configurations that we want rather than using the set command here. So let's talk about some other configurations. Well, maybe we have a database server template that we want to create, and database servers typically are going to be doing a lot of heavy data processing tasks. And so database servers will oftentimes need more CPU cores allocated to them. The default profile only assigns a single CPU core in LXD. And oftentimes, database servers also need more memory or RAM in order to run large queries against the databases that they contain. So instead of using the default LXD 1 GB of RAM, maybe a database server needs 4 GB of RAM. And rather than having to customize the amount of memory on each individual virtual machine, we can define a profile that has those database server settings inside of it, and then simply associate that profile with all of the virtual machines that need those particular settings. So what's really interesting about profiles in LXD is that we can assign more than one profile to a LXD virtual machine. Even though the default profile has certain settings, we can actually append additional settings by not replacing the default profile with a custom profile, but actually adding a custom profile to the default profile, thereby associating multiple profiles with a specific virtual machine. And the way that we can do that, or at least one way that we can do that, is by using LXC profile add, and that will simply append or associate the newly specified profile with whatever virtual machine we specify in that command. Now, things can start to get a little bit more complex when we start doing multiple profiles. Let's take a look at another example here. So we're going to create another example profile called Alpine. And if you've watched some of my earlier videos on LXD, you probably have realized that Alpine Linux doesn't work with Secure Boot. And Secure Boot is actually enabled by default. But in order to launch an Alpine Linux virtual machine, we actually have to explicitly disable this Secure Boot setting. So what we might do is create an Alpine profile and then specify that the security.secureboot setting should be set to false rather than the default, which is true. Also, for Alpine Linux, maybe we want to generally have 2 GB of RAM instead of the default profile's 1 GB of RAM. But what happens if you run into a situation where you have multiple profiles that are actually specifying the same setting? Well, that results in a conflict, right? We have one profile like DB server that specifies that the virtual machine should have 4 GB of memory, whereas the Alpine Linux profile specifies that the virtual machine should have 2 GB of memory. So which one wins? Which of those profiles is going to actually win out and configure the virtual machine? Well, in LXD, profiles can actually be applied in a specific order. So when you look at the configuration of a LXD virtual machine, the profiles will actually be listed in a particular order, and the last profile that is specified is going to be the one that ultimately wins the battle of conflicting settings. So if we start with default and then go to DB server and then end with Alpine, then the 2 GB of memory is going to win out. And because there's no conflict on the CPUs, the virtual machine will still have 4 CPU cores. It's just not going to have 4 GB of memory. It'll have 2 GB of memory instead. If we switched things around and started with default and then did Alpine and then did DB server, well, the DB server being the last one that's applied is ultimately going to win out. And so the virtual machine would correctly have 4 GB of RAM as are allocated for our database servers. So keep in mind that there is a specific order that profiles are applied to virtual machines. And the way that we can specify that order is by using LXC profile assign, specify the VM that we want to configure profiles on, and then we can have a comma separated list of profiles that we want to apply in a specific order. So we might do LXC profile assign, specify the virtual machine name like U01, and then say default and then Alpine, and then DB server at the end, and that would give us an order that allows the memory for the database server to win out over the smaller amount that we have for Alpine Linux. But if we deployed a virtual machine that was not a database server and we only had default and Alpine, then an Alpine Linux virtual machine could have secure boot disabled, but it'll have 2 gigabytes of RAM instead of 4 gigabytes that a database server would need. Also, something that's really interesting is that once a profile has been applied to a virtual machine, you can actually change the settings in the profile either by using LXD Profile set or by doing the interactive edit command, and you can change the values of these different configuration options or even add new configuration options to these profiles, and you can actually change the configuration of virtual machines that are already associated with that particular profile. However, certain settings, like changing the amount of memory associated with a virtual machine, will actually require a reboot before that change can take effect, because you can't hot add or hot remove memory from a LXD virtual machine. All right, so now that we understand some basic concepts about LXD profiles, let's talk about some tasks that you can practice on your LXD host in order to better understand how profiles work. And we're going to be going through some of these in our demonstration section of this video. So first of all, just start out by creating a custom profile. It's really easy to do. All you have to do is specify LXD profile create, give it a name, and then you're going to start with an empty configuration block that you can add instance options to if you want to customize your VMs. You can also launch an LXD virtual machine with a custom profile. You don't have to do this. You can always add the profile after the fact, but in the case of certain settings like expanding the root file system, that is something that you would have to do at launch time, because changing the root file system size with a profile after the fact isn't going to work properly. You can also modify an assigned LXD profile while the VM is running. Just keep in mind that certain settings will require a reboot or potentially require the VM to be in a stopped state before that change can actually take effect on the VM itself. Also, practice assigning multiple profiles. Always remember that the ordering matters with profile assignments and that you can specify which order you want those profiles to be assigned in. And then finally, you can even remove profiles from a running virtual machine as well, and potentially change some of the settings on that virtual machine by simply changing which profiles have been associated with that VM. All right, so with that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually spend some hands-on time with LXD profiles. But before we do that, I'm actually going to point you over to the LXD documentation here. If you go under the instances section here and then go down to instance configuration, we've got instance options here, which is a pretty large document that has various tables of different settings that you can apply to your virtual machines, including things like CPU limits and memory limits, and things like the secure boot setting under security down here. And then we also have devices here. So devices like PCI devices or network interfaces or disks that you want to add to virtual machines. All of these different things are supported inside of profiles as well, because the profiles support both instance configuration options as well as devices. So just keep that in mind. All right, so now we're going to switch over to my LXD host right here. This is actually a Hyper-V virtual machine, so I'm actually doing nested virtualization here. So my LXD host is actually running on my Windows 11 Hyper-V host here. But if I take a look at the configuration here with BTOP, you can see I've got 4 virtual CPUs on this LXD host, as well as 10 gigabytes of memory. So we have enough system resources to play with as we spin up nested virtual machines here. Also, if I check out the version really quick, I am currently running 5.13, which is the latest stable release installed with the snap package for Ubuntu Linux. And then if I do a sudo lsb release --all, you can see I'm running Ubuntu 22.04 Jammy Jellyfish, which is the latest long-term support or LTS release of Ubuntu Linux server. All right, so what we're going to do now is test out the profiles feature. So for starters, we're going to take a look at the profile command here. And I just wanted to start out by listing the profiles, because on a default system here, you're just going to have this default profile. And as you can see, it tells you how many virtual machines are using that profile. So right now, if I do an LXC list, I don't have any virtual machines created. So of course, 0 virtual machines are using the default profile. But let's actually look at what's inside of the default profile itself. So we'll do an LXC profile show and then specify the default profile. And as you can see under the devices section right down here, it specifies an Ethernet network adapter, a virtual Ethernet adapter, I should say, as well as the root file system. It doesn't specify the size here, but if you create a virtual machine from the default profile, it will be a 10 gigabyte disk. And only the first 4 gigabytes are typically allocated for the actual partition, for the root partition, and you can always expand that root partition or just create extra partitions in the available space on that 10 gigabyte virtual disk. So let's go ahead and create a custom profile. So what I'm going to do is say LXC profile create. And let's create one for Alpine Linux, right? In our slides, we took a look at how to maybe create a profile for Alpine Linux that disables secure boot and allocates a little bit of extra memory, right? So we'll create one called Alpine here. And so when we create this profile, it's not going to have any configuration inside of it. If we do an LXC profile show on Alpine, you can see there's no devices, there's no instance configuration options. So we actually have to go through and specify which options we want this profile to set on any virtual machines that it's associated with. So what we'll do is say LXC profile set. And what we're going to do is specify the name of the profile that we want to modify. Then we'll specify, we take a look at the help here, we specify the key, which is basically the setting we want to modify, and then the value that we want to set that particular setting to. So in our slides, we took a look at an example of Alpine, and maybe we want to set limits.memory equal to 2 gigabytes. And just like that, we've added an option to our profile. So if I just hit the up arrow a few times and show our profile, you can see that we've got 2 gigabytes of memory with this profile. We don't have any disk configuration though. We don't have any network interface configuration because we're still relying on the default profile to do that for us. So let's go ahead and launch a virtual machine with the default profile alone, and then we'll launch another one with the default and the Alpine profile, and we'll see the difference in the memory configuration. We'll do LXC launch, VM, we'll do a config and say security.secure boot equals false. And we'll specify images Alpine 3.18, and we'll just call it A01. Now, we didn't specify the profile option here on the launch command. So if we do LXC launch --help, you'll actually see that there's this profile option that allows us to specify profiles that we want to apply to the new virtual machine instance. But because we didn't specify any in this command, only the default profile is going to apply to this machine. So if we do an LXC profile list, you'll see that now the default profile here is used by one virtual machine, whereas Alpine is still not used by any. So let's launch a second virtual machine. We'll do profile default, and then we'll specify --profile a second time, and we'll specify Alpine as the profile name. And we'll just change the name to A02 instead. And so now we should have two different virtual machines, one that only uses default and one that now uses the Alpine profile. So now we have two using default, but only one of those is using the Alpine profile. Let's do an LXC exec on A01, and we'll go into an interactive shell here. And if we run lsmem, let's actually find the package for that. It'll be apk add util linux miscellaneous. And so we can install this package with the apk package manager and just run lsmem here. You can see that A01 has 1 gigabyte of memory. We'll exit out of that interactive shell, and we'll get an interactive shell on A02 as soon as it comes up right here. And now that the virtual machine is running, we can do an apk search lsmem. Let's just do an apk add util linux misc once again. And on this VM, we'll also run LSMem, and as you can see, it's got about 2 gigabytes of memory. So we've taken that Alpine profile and applied it after the default profile, and so now we've overridden the default configuration for the amount of memory on this virtual machine. Now, something else that's really interesting that we can do is to edit the profile while it's in use by a virtual machine. As you may know from one of my other videos, you can actually hot add virtual CPUs to virtual machines created with LXD. So let's go ahead and actually try to do that, but rather than doing it directly on the VM configuration, we're going to use profiles to change the configuration of our existing A02 virtual machine here. All right, so what we're going to do is use LXD Profile, and this time we're going to use the edit command to interactively edit the YAML configuration, and we'll specify the name of the profile that we want to modify. So right down here under the config section, you can see that we are customizing the amount of memory, but we don't have limits.cpu. So let's go ahead and set that, and we'll just set it to the number 2. So we'll go ahead and write that configuration change. And we come back to our shell on the LXD host, and we don't really see any changes at this point in time. But if we go back into A02 right here and run lscpu, you can actually see that there are 2 CPUs. One of them is online. That's the original one that it was started with. But now there's a second CPU that has been hot added into this Alpine Linux VM. So what we could do is bring that CPU online. So we'll do chcpu -- enable 1, and now we've enabled that CPU, and if we do lscpu, we can see that both 0 and 1 CPU cores are now online on this node. We can do the same thing by actually hot removing CPU cores. So if we go back and edit the profile for our Alpine profile here, and just change the CPU count to 1, you can see that nothing really happens once again. A02 is still up and running, but if we run lscpu now, you can see that only CPU core 0 is currently online, and there's only one CPU core associated with this virtual machine. So it's really that easy to use a profile to configure these options. Now, something else that we probably want to do with our Alpine profile here is to add in the secure boot setting. So if we add in security.secureboot, and just set that to a Boolean false value, that'll make sure that anytime we launch a virtual machine with the Alpine profile, that setting will be set to false so that we don't have to specify it as a -- config option when we launch a new virtual machine. So if we go back and take a look at our launch command right here, we previously had to make sure that we specified this config right here, but now, as long as we specify profile Alpine, that setting is implied, and any new virtual machines that we launch are going to work just fine because that is set in the profile rather than setting it in line with the VM configuration. Awesome. So now we've launched a third virtual machine, and everything is great. So now let's talk about command or setting overrides, I should say, instance option overrides. So we talked about how if a setting is conflicted, that we have to look at the profile application order in order to determine which setting is going to win in the fight between conflicting settings. So let's go ahead and create another profile here, and we'll call this a DB server. We'll say create DB server. And we'll go ahead and edit this profile. So we'll do a LXD profile set command on the DB server profile, and we'll set limits.cpu to 4, and we'll set limits.memory to 4 gigabytes. All right, so now we're going to still use Alpine Linux here, but we are going to specify both the Alpine profile as well as the DB server profile and see what happens. So what I'm actually going to do here is delete my A03 virtual machine, and we'll just go ahead and relaunch that using our profiles here. So we'll go back to our launch command, and we're going to add profile DB server this time when we launch the A03 virtual machine. So based on this launch command right here, which of those settings do you think is going to win? Do you think we're going to get 2 gigabytes of memory, or do you think we're going to get 4 gigabytes of memory? Well, let's find out. So what we'll do is get an exec shell, interactive shell on that virtual machine. And then you can either use the lsmem command to look at the memory, or you could install btop. It's really up to you. There's lots of different ways that you could inspect the memory on there, but we're just going to see if we have either 2 or 4 gigabytes. All right, now that we've got our interactive shell on our Alpine Linux VM, let's see how much memory we've got. So I'll go ahead and do an apk add util linux misc once again, and we'll just do an lsmem. And if you answered 4 gigabytes, then you would be correct. And that's because the DB server profile was specified last after the Alpine profile, and the Alpine profile specified 2 gigabytes. Therefore, because DB server was last and specified 4 gigabytes, that is how much memory our virtual machine is going to get. So in any case, I hope that these demonstrations kind of show you how profiles work, but I always encourage you to spend some hands-on time with LXD, practice playing around with these profiles and creating your own custom profiles, put the profiles in different orders, and feel free to dynamically add and remove them from your virtual machines and see what kind of effects they have. In any case, thanks again for watching this video on LXD Profiles. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.